I'm a journalist and an author. I kind of came at this whole career from running and started writing about running. I moved to Seattle after graduating from college and worked at Microsoft. I was a systems and test engineer there for 8 years. And I left actually to try to become one of the athletes that I've written about. I was a trail and ultra runner, and I left my career to pursue a dream. Now I'm not as fast as them, and I had a sort of middling career where I was a, poorly paid pro. I'd say that's probably the most accurate way to put it. But I gave it a shot, and it was a blast. And as I was leaving that career, I had begun to write about adventure running and adventure sports. And that's really how I got into journalism to begin with. I was a columnist for Trail Runner magazine. And I had, kind of grown up, as probably many of you, in endurance sports and becoming an endurance athlete with, the big Lance Armstrong story happening in the background. And, I bought a yellow wristband, and I was a true fan of what I thought was, real hard work paying off in Tour de France victories. And so when that all blew up, I was sort of disillusioned, and I was just becoming a writer at that point, but followed the story, read all the books, loved David Walsh's work and Juliet McCur's work in the New York Times. And that was a number of years before I had written really anything of consequence, but I was writing for Trail Runner and sort of, building a career really. But that was a seminal moment for me to become interested in, doping in sport, and in general, sort of as a topic. And so from there, I began to write for various venues, for various magazines, mostly about doping in sport. From Chris Carmichael to Italian Ultra Runner that had been caught using EPO. And so I had a little bit of a burgeoning beat, I guess you'd say, when in 2017, I was reading everything and doing a little bit of reporting on my own on the Nike Oregon story, because it was the big story in the news. And what happened was the Fancy Bears Russian hacking organization hacked into the United States anti-doping agency's mail servers, and they stole a file, a report that USADA, the United States anti-doping agency, had put together for the Texas Medical Board. So the Nike team had a doctor in Texas, and to get, obviously medical records are usually private, and to get them released to the United States anti-doping agency, they had to present a case against Alberto, Dr. Jeffrey Brown, and the Nike Oregon project. And what happened was the Fancy Bears stole that file in a hack, and it ended up in my mailbox. And so that's how the whole story really began for me. I read it 8 times, I think, and then I reached out to my editor at the New York Times and other publications. And, that was May 17 when I wrote that story. And from there, it's just taken over my life until now, to be honest with you, with the book. It led to the book and researching the book and writing the book, which took me about 3 years. And of course, the hardcover came out in October of 2020, and the paperback has just been released. So the hardcover, and the paperback, which has just been released. So that's how I came to this story. So I think from here, I'll do a bit of reading from the book. And I'll jump around just a little bit, a few shortish sections. But the first part I'm going to read to you here is really sort of the chapter on the genesis of the Nike Oregon project. It's chapter 3. It's called "What Are You On?" And that's a reference later in the chapter to Lance Armstrong, the famous Lance Armstrong commercial where he's riding his bike in the rain, and basically admits that everyone's been accusing him of things, but he's only on his bike, not on drugs, which is laughable at this point that they had the gall to put together quite such a commercial. But they were nothing if not bold and combative at the time. So this is chapter 3, "What Are You On?" On an April Monday in 2001, Alberto Salazar sauntered into the Boston Deli on Nike's campus, eager to watch the 105th running of the Boston Marathon that was being broadcast on the television in the corporate cafeteria bearing its name. He sat down with Tom Clark, a former competitive runner and a Nike vice president, to enjoy the race. As a maniacally focused 23-year-old professional Nike-sponsored athlete, Salazar had won the event in 1982. His stride-for-stride battle of wills with Dick Beardsley is most likely the most thrilling Boston Marathon ever run, a day that came to be known as the Duel in the Sun. As the 2001 race proceeded, the two men grew increasingly frustrated with the poor showing of the US athletes. They weren't competitive, they weren't impressive, and they weren't even in the top 5. It hadn't always been this way. In the 1970s, America produced some of the best distance runners in the world. Bill Rogers won both the Boston and the New York City marathons 4 times each. At the Munich Olympics in 1972, the United States claimed 1st, 4th, and 9th in the marathon event, the best finish by 3 male runners from a single nation since 1908. One of Steve Prefontaine's closest friends, former track star Frank Shorter, won the gold medal that year. And he was on his way to a repeat in the following Olympiad when he was robbed of the victory by an East German man named Waldemar Sierpinski, who was later found to be part of the country's infamous doping program, though Shorter still managed to finish 2nd in the world. US athletes wearing Nike shoes and swooshes had once dominated the global running scene, setting world records, medaling at the Olympics, and winning the sport's marquee events. Salazar himself had personally ruled the early 1980s, winning 3 New York City marathons and 1 Boston. But it was now painfully obvious that the national performance drought, which arguably began when an injured and overtrained Salazar begrudgingly stepped out of the spotlight, was starting to bleed into the new century. Salazar and Clark knew the state of affairs. From 1983 to 2001, American distance runners had won only 4% of world championship and Olympic gold medals, and only 1 male American-born runner had won a top-tier marathon since Salazar won the 1982 New York City Marathon. Excuse me. East African countries like Kenya and Ethiopia had superseded the American athletes in the elite ranks. But it wasn't just that the US athletes were simply losing to the Africans. They were also somehow getting slower. As the televised event proceeded, Clark and Salazar watched as Korean athlete Jung-Boon Lee outpaced an Ecuadorian runner and 3 Kenyans to win the Boston Marathon in a time of 2 hours, 9 minutes, and 43 seconds. When the first American, 34-year-old Rod DeHaven, crossed the finish line, the announcers gushed about him finishing in the top 10. Tom and I just looked at each other, Salazar told the New Yorker. It was like, wow, we've sunk so low that 6th place is considered an accomplishment. Almost 2 decades of lackluster American performances had made the US sports establishment desperate for a homegrown hero to challenge the African dominance. I told Tom that I could coach Americans to do better, said Salazar. Tom got out a pen and started writing down some ideas: coaching, talent, sports science. The 2 men hatched a plan to bring American running back to prominence on the international stage. If the state wasn't going to support American athletes, then Nike would. The idea was simple: incubate the next great American world beater, a Tiger Woods or Lance Armstrong for the running world, and watch sales take off. Clark convincingly pitched the idea to Knight, who quickly signed off on it. That's Phil Knight, the founder of Nike. Salazar, who had been a Nike stalwart for years as both a sponsored athlete and more recently an employee in the marketing department, would lead the group that would lean on new technologies and methods. Throughout his running career, unorthodox procedures, chemicals, techniques, supplements, and tinctures had been his stock and trade. He suggested a marathon training approach that would harness the obscure technology as a way to equalize the African dominance. Clark, a veteran of 35 marathons who has a doctorate in biomechanics, was sold. The timing seemed to be right too, due to the crop of young high school boys that had the nation talking about a possible American competitive resurgence. Deemed the Big Three, Alan Webb, Dathan Ritzenheim, and Ryan Hall had each dominated their high school's competitions. The previous December, they had met at the National Crucible of High School Running, the Foot Locker Cross Country Championships, where Ritzenheim won Webb placed second, and Hall came in third. In May, Webb ran the mile in 3 minutes, 53.43 seconds, breaking Jim Ryan's high school record for the distance that stood for 36 years. The future looked bright, and if Nike could get the program up and running, it would be primed to receive the next great wave of American talent. With Salazar at the helm, a new team, which would later be called the Nike Oregon Project, would take advantage of the corporation's generous financial reserves to create a closely monitored, scientifically advanced, and technologically sophisticated training milieu like nothing ever before attempted with US athletes. So that's the beginning of the chapter on how the Nike Oregon Project got its start and exactly why. One of the things I won't read, but is important to understand, is Nike getting its start in 1963 really was a running brand. So it's foundational to the brand. They started with Bill Bowerman and Phil Knight at the University of Oregon. Phil Knight graduated, went to Stanford, got his MBA, and he had noticed a great business in importing knockoff cameras from Japan. And so he wrote a paper at his MBA program in Stanford. And then after graduation, actually went to Japan, went to the tracks, saw some of the athletes, saw what they were running in, and came back with the idea to import cheap Adidas knockoff sneakers. That's how Nike got started. And so Onitsuka was the company that he signed with, and he started importing cheap Adidas knockoffs to sell to Bill Bowerman, his former coach at the University of Oregon. So all that to say, running's foundational to the brand. They're now, obviously the largest global sports brand. It's funny, I was looking at the numbers today. When I finished writing the book, their market capitalization was 130 billion. When I started doing the initial press back in October of 2020, their market cap was 160 billion. And I looked at it today and it's 260 billion. So obviously, wildly successful, the most successful by multiples. Adidas is still second to them. I think their market cap's 4 times that of Adidas. So this running program got started right in Beaverton, Oregon, on the Nike campus. It had, pretty lackluster results at first. And around 2004, Salazar started to get really serious about the athletes. He was handpicking them now and kind of blaming the former athletes for not being good enough. That's why we don't have enough success. It certainly wasn't his coaching. He was really, in news clippings in a Wired article, a friend of mine wrote back in the day, he sort of called them B+ talent. We need A+ talent. And so he found the Gouchers, Adam and Kara Goucher, famous Olympians and American runners. Of course, Kara would eventually turn whistleblower on him in the program and go sit down with the United States Anti-Doping Agency. But I've got a couple of shorter sections here on the Gouchers. And so the book starts, here's the prologue. It's called Honey, the FBI is at the door. On a Sunday afternoon in July 2017, two inconspicuously, sorry, I'm gonna check the time. All right, I'm good. On Sunday afternoon in July 2017, two inconspicuously dressed men approached the front gate to Adam and Kara Goucher's yard in Boulder, Colorado. The family mongrel, Freya, started barking, which alerted Kara to them. She was in no mood for visitors. Earlier that day, she had bombed out of a 16-mile race pace workout on the road and was now both irritable and hungry. She turned over the salmon she was cooking for dinner and said to Adam, "Someone's coming to the door. Do not let them in." The special agents arrived in Boulder earlier that day and decided to change out of their suits after an hour of driving around town. Though Boulder's reputation as a city for hippies is steadily being supplanted by one of opulent wealth, it's rare to see a suit within city limits, and they were worried that they would draw unwanted attention. Now, in jeans and polo shirts, the men fussed with the front gate. Adam went out to meet them, and after a brief introduction, led them inside. Kara glared at her husband, but he gave her a warning look. "These guys are FBI agents," he said. Kara set the stove to simmer as their 6-year-old son, Colton, peeked up from behind the couch where he was playing. The investigators told the couple, they'd like to ask a few questions about their former mentor, Alberto Salazar, and their one-time employer, Nike Incorporated. Until now, the Gauchos had no idea that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was looking into the controversy the couple had been mired in ever since they turned whistleblower on their coach in 2013, when they reported his alleged misdeeds to the United States Anti-Doping Agency, USADA. No one involved had yet been sanctioned, but the visit that day from the FBI was a soft assurance that they hadn't been whistleblowing into the wind, and that there might, at some point, be retribution. USADA's power lies in its ability to ban and suspend athletes, coaches, and doctors from involvement in competition, but they're not a law enforcement agency. The FBI, however, has the power to incarcerate. Still, Kara wasn't ready to discuss the details of an investigation that had upturned her life in more ways than one. Turning to the agents, she said, "Can you come back after dinner?" And so now I'll jump a little bit further where the FBI agents come back. And this is a pretty short section here. And then we can open it up to some Q&A. After leaving the Nike Oregon project in 2013, the Gauchos returned to Boulder, a town that calls itself the Bubble because there doesn't seem to be anyone within its city limits who isn't astonishingly fit, accomplished, and wealthy. Here, your neighbor is likely to be a former Olympian, and you might recognize the guy next to you in line at Whole Foods from the latest Patagonia catalog. Because of Boulder's altitude, climate, and topography, it's a place where athletes move to focus their lives on training for endurance sports. Take, for instance, the road up Flagstaff Mountain, just a few blocks from the Gauchos' home. It's a route on which both professional and recreational cyclists often test themselves against the more than 2,300 feet of uphill and the clock. A ride on which known dopers Tom Danielson and Levi Leifheimer still hold record times. Neither of the Gauchos have ever ridden up Flagstaff on a bike. They don't rock climb the Flatiron peaks that jut out from the ground on Boulder's western flank. They don't fight the I-70 traffic to ski on the weekends at one of the nearby world-class resorts. The Gauchos are runners. They've dedicated their lives to the simple pursuit of being as fast as humanly possible in the most basic and primal of sports. Today, their familial tides are dictated by the dual moons of Kara's training requirements and parenting. She is in the twilight of her career, a critical point in which an athlete either goes back to the private sector or floats up from earth like a child's balloon, and somehow maintains a life in the limelight, propelled by the winds of past achievements. There's little doubt which one Kara will do. At age 39, she still looks like she could win a major marathon, and the fresh face that endeared her to running fans all over the world has barely aged. Adam retired from running in 2011 after a string of injuries that left him with a hitch in his stride and compromised mobility. Now he more closely resembles a CrossFit athlete than a waif-like distance runner. He is affable but intense and easily animated by talk of performance-enhancing drugs. "I think that 90% of US sports are dirty," he told me. "I'm talking basketball, football, baseball, tennis, running, all of them. And they're stealing money from clean athletes. It's not fair." When the Gauchos welcomed the FBI agents back into their home promptly at 7:30, after they had heeded Kara's demand, their yard sat bathed in fading light. Beyond them, the Flatiron mountain range bustled with rock climbers, cyclists, and trail runners. The couple sat at the dinner table and for the next few hours began to tell the story of their athletic careers to the two agents seated across from them. "Okay, now tell us exactly what happened at Nike."